Question for you. What are you doing on November 3rd? I want to personally invite you to join me, Nicole Jardim, Laura Bryden, and Jessica Drummond for an epic event, Hack Your Cycles to Change Your Life. This is an intimate one-day event in New York City focused on the menstrual cycle and why it's important for health. Virtual tickets are also available. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/New York for tickets and additional details. Again, that's fertilityfriday.com/New York. This episode is brought to you by my free 3-part video series, FAM 101. Discover how to chart your cycles by tracking the 3 main fertile signs: cervical mucus, basal body temperature, and cervical position. And ultimately, develop body literacy by paying attention to your fertile signs. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAM101 to grab your free copy. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAM101. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 225. Welcome to the 225th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. Today, I have a very special episode for you. So in today's episode, we're talking about a topic that I have not yet talked about on the podcast, even though the podcast has been going for nearly 4 years now. So in today's episode, we're actually talking about fertility preservation. And I would say fertility preservation is pretty controversial. And I would say that because, so for those of you, we'll talk about it in the podcast, so I won't give it all away. But, the Cliff's Notes version is it's freezing your eggs. And freezing your eggs for that future possibility that you might want to have children later, but for whatever reason, it's kind of like an insurance policy, like a fertility insurance policy. And so the reason I would say it's controversial is because it's super expensive. It's an elective procedure. So the price definitely, it precludes some women obviously it just makes it such that it's not an option for every single woman. But it's an interesting topic. And I think that, the reason why I wanted to have Valerie on the show to talk about it is because it's something that we don't really talk about. And although, I'm not trying to promote or dissuade, I would say I'm fairly neutral on the topic. So I have no desire to try to convince anybody to do anything. I think it's more just, it's there, it's available, people are doing it, and maybe you should know about it. But when I think about fertility preservation, I feel like it's the reason that I want to share about it is because it gets women thinking about how our fertility changes with time. And so that part of the conversation is what really intrigues me, because as we get older, our fertility does change. And part of what's missing in our discussion about fertility is just how serious of an impact age does have. And so, that's a topic, the topic of aging and fertility. That's a topic that has come out in many of the different episodes that I've recorded over the years. And I'll link several of those episodes in the show notes page so that you can refer back, especially if you're newer to the show and you haven't heard a lot of them. So I'll definitely link some of the episodes where we specifically talk about the impact of age on fertility. But so that's why this topic is of interest to me, not because I think every woman should go out and do it, which is the controversial part. It's really expensive. It's an invasive procedure, but it makes you think, and it kind of prevents you from being able to take for granted just the idea that, I have all the time in the world. It kind of brings it back to I don't have all the time in the world. Eventually there will become a time when I'm no longer able to have children. And, maybe this is something I should be thinking about, not necessarily going full blown fertility preservation, but definitely thinking about it, making choices, and all those types of things. So I'm really excited to share today's episode with you just to kind of start that conversation. And I'd love to hear from you in the Facebook group. So if you're not part of the Fertility Friday Facebook group, head over to fertilityfriday.com/community, because we will be talking about this in here in the group. And I'm curious to hear all opinions, because I'm sure that some women would think, it's pretty benign, whatever. If you want to freeze your eggs, go for it. But I would imagine that some women would say, well, this is a little bit excessive, and, you're still subjecting your body to these hormones and everything. So I feel like there's an interesting discussion to be had there on both sides regarding fertility preservation. Now, with that said, let's jump into today's episode with Valerie Landis. So I'm really excited to welcome my guest, Valerie Landis, to the show today. Valerie has been working in women's health for the last decade. Her medical career experiences and passion for helping women merged when she founded her educational website, Experience.com. That's Eggsperience.com. She focuses on guiding women of any reproductive age through the complex and challenging paths of fertility decisions. And Valerie complements the Experience website with a fertility podcast called the Eggology Club that she hosts to continue to change the conversation around cryopreservation and egg freezing. Valerie empowers women to feel inspired, brave, and act progressively to take control of their future families and protect their fertility. She speaks openly about her own personal egg freezing experience and family planning decisions, along with highlighting a collection of firsthand accounts from other women's fertility journeys. And so in today's show, we will be talking about fertility preservation and egg freezing. So welcome to the show, Valerie.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thanks so much for being here. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. And so it's been in the periphery a little bit of my show, but this is the first episode that we're actually diving in and talking about egg freezing. And so before we dive into it, I'd love to get a sense of your background. And so although I went through and, read the bio, but I'd like to get a sense of what brought you to this point and why did you want to make this your area of focus to kind of bring awareness to it?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. My career launched me into learning about women's healthcare issues, coming from like a more of a sales perspective and a marketing perspective, and seeing all these fertility choices from a career standpoint. And throughout my career, over 10 years in women's health, I slowly started to learn about all these things that would affect me too, or my friends, or people that I know that are struggling with fertility, family planning, and options. And so I feel really blessed that my career launched me into this pivoting space. And then I was able to essentially learn about the technology from an educated standpoint, because I feel like, we do women such a disservice. We don't seem to educate them on all the new technologies that are coming down the pipeline. But a lot of those technologies have just been kind of new, hot topics that are currently coming mainstream and becoming more affordable. So that's the key is, when the affordability meets the demand. And so when I was working throughout my career in women's health, I sold birth control to medical devices, to fertility, different products, and into the lab space. And so I started getting to know all these doctors very intimately and also learning about my fertility health. So that's kind of what pivoted me into deciding to use the technology of egg freezing, which is a very hot topic right now and in the press and the media a lot. And even companies are now paying for it. That's what pivoted me to personally decide to use egg freezing for my own family planning choices.
Well, I think that the kind of general idea, I'm just going to assume that the audience knows what it is, but just to kind of make sure that we're all on the same page. So fertility preservation is the word that's used, right, to refer to freezing your eggs. So maybe just tell us just so that we all know what we're talking about here.
Yeah, so egg freezing can be known as a bunch of different terms, right? So an egg is also known clinically as an oocyte. And when we freeze, that's called cryopreservation. So sometimes it's known as just cryopreservation. Sometimes it's known as egg freezing. Common knowledge is more like egg freezing, but it can be preservation of embryos too, which embryos are an egg and a sperm when they are put together, and they have DNA structure that make a new possible human. That's an embryo. So when you freeze eggs, it's just the female biological DNA. And men can also freeze sperm, which is just their biological DNA. But when you merge them together, that's an embryo. So sometimes, because freezing is often talked about for heterosexual couples or maybe any third-party reproduction, a lot of times we forget that egg freezing is an option too. So egg freezing is relatively new. In 2012, the ASRM, American Society of Reproductive Medicine, deemed it not experimental. So until that point, because eggs are so fragile and they have this very liquid, fluid-based system, it was really hard to freeze because if you think about anything you put in the freezer, it expands and eggs would burst. And so it was really hard to freeze the woman's DNA or the female DNA. And so when they discovered vitrification, which is kind of a fast freeze, so instead of 3 to 4 minutes freezing a DNA specimen, it would only take less than 90 seconds. And when they discovered how to do that, then that is kind of when egg freezing became more mainstream.
Well, that is great. I feel like that short explanation really cleared a lot of different things up. And you actually, in our pre-chat, you had briefly mentioned the interview that I recorded with Sarah Cohen. And in that interview, she talked about some of the complexities between freezing an embryo with your partner versus freezing your own eggs. And in that particular conversation, it was more towards like what happens if you and your partner split up and then you have these embryos. Mm-hmm. And in some countries, there's laws that would tell you can't use them. So I think thank you for explaining that difference between just freezing your own eggs and then freezing the combined, genetic material of two people. And so I guess we should go from the very beginning. Why would you want to freeze your eggs? Like, why would this be something that we would want to do?
So egg freezing has lots of benefits. First off, it stops the biological clock. So as women, we have the on-duty responsibility to essentially be our own family planners. Men make new sperm every single month or every 3 months. And so they're continuously making new sperm. Whereas women, we're born with all the eggs that we'll ever have in our lifetime. And so as we age, our eggs age too. And so while we may not feel 35 or 40, let's say, biologically, our eggs are getting to the point where they will not reproduce as easily, right? So they slowly get aged over time. Now, it'd be great if we could just Botox them and make them new again, but unfortunately we can't. So egg freezing provides a way to stop the biological clock and freeze time at that age and give you more options in the future. Now, it does take several eggs in order to equal an embryo, which was what we were talking about earlier when we inject the sperm or another person's DNA and we make that future baby. So when we freeze eggs, it's just your DNA, and that's great because then you haven't chose the other party of who that future baby will be. And then you don't have to worry about another party coming back and saying, oh, well, I don't actually want babies with you now. So you lose the option to be able, or possibly have to fight for the option. And I've had several women tell me stories about this. So freezing eggs just gives you the possibility that you can freeze your DNA at that period of time and be able to, in a later date, move forward to your family future.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so I've done several different interviews over the years about aging and fertility. And so that's something I'm really passionate about because, as you know, as women, we're taught a lot about the whole, the myth that we can get pregnant on every single day of our cycle. So, in my case, and pretty much every woman I've talked to, you kind of leave junior high with this idea that there's just this constant threat of pregnancy. And so we're taught a lot about how to use birth control and how to prevent an unplanned pregnancy from happening. But what we're not taught is how our fertility changes as we age. So I think it leaves most of us with the impression that, we're fertile every single day. We can get pregnant all the time. So you're just as, fertile, say at the age of 20 as you are at 35. And even though we're told also kind of that our fertility changes, I've spoken to so many women on the pill in their mid-30s who are still just as terrified of getting pregnant as they were when they were 20. So with all of that said, just take us a little bit more into why this is so important for women to consider, even though it might seem kind of extreme. It's getting more mainstream and it's getting more press. But I think it's safe to say that most of us, for most of us, it's not something like every single one of your girlfriends is doing.
Yeah, no, I think it's becoming more mainstream, but the process is a little bit taxing. So some people are scared of maybe the hormone shots and the things that they have to do in order to prep, because on an everyday cycle or an every month cycle, you're really only releasing 1 or maybe 2 eggs. When you do fertility cryopreservation, you are trying to make as many eggs as possible grow to the mature state so it can be frozen. And so that is a little taxing on the body. You take hormones for about 2 weeks. And during those hormone cycle weeks, it's actually very much like IVF without the F, right? You're still stimulating your body up to the point where you're going to retrieve your eggs and pull them out, but you're not going to make them a human yet, right? So you're just going to freeze your DNA. And part of the reason this is important is because it gives you more options. So if, for example, I froze my eggs at 33, there's not a lot of really great tests out there that can tell you what your status is for your age. And, 33 is relatively young, but I had an AMH test, which is an anti-Müllerian hormone test that is a blood draw essentially that measures your fertility status, right? And then I had a pelvic ultrasound, which is also just to measure or check out my fallopian tubes, make sure they're not blocked, to make sure I have follicles in my resting state. And between those 2 tests, it gave me a perspective of where I stand in my fertility at that point. Now, I suggest every woman go and at least get the AMH test and an anti-follicle ultrasound. And that way you can kind of predict, well, where are you at? But think about how dating has changed and relationships are changing. And, we're maybe not finding our parenting partner at the time that is when we're most fertile, in between that 30, 35 window, maybe when we're ready. And we're delaying parenthood because, we're getting more education, we're doing post-grad schools or doctorate programs, or maybe our career is just really taxing. And so between all those factors, it's really hard to find the right time to have a family. And let's just say you get hit with cancer or some kind of life-threatening illness. Well, then you have to think about cryopreservation for those reasons too. And if you do it ahead of time, like I suggest and actually counsel a lot of women in interviews you can see on experience.com or the podcast Eggology Club, where women are actually now doing this after they get done with college. And so their parents are gifting them after school. We plan for our financial future, right? We plan for our educational careers, but no one tells you how to plan for your family future. And so by taking the reins by the horns by the reins here and being proactive versus being reactive, like if there was a cancer in the mix or something, we essentially are protecting our future and our family down the line.
Mm-hmm. It's like buying insurance.
There's lots of really great. Yeah, it's insurance in some aspects, but you have to definitely make sure that the numbers are in your favor, right? So this is like a little bit of Games of Thrones, if you will say, where essentially you have to combat all of these possible life situations. So it is a taxing financially. You have to plan for it, right? So egg freezing in most areas of the country ranges just for the egg freezing between $5,000 and $8,000. That's about standard. And there's great ways you could ask for packages, or, you can ask your clinic for any discount med programs. You can shop pharmacy discounts, and there's drug relief programs or indigent programs where you can get meds at a discount. So it's really just about like knowing your options, asking the right questions, interviewing your doctor so you feel comfortable with that clinic, and asking like, how many eggs have you thawed successfully? And that is the key component to finding like the going through this egg freezing process like without any interruptions or any kind of, like hiccups. And then that way you plan and you feel good about that plan. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I actually suggest that you do it when you're younger because you're going to get a higher yield of eggs. You'll have to do it less time. You'll bounce back faster. So I froze my eggs when I was 33, and I got 17 successfully frozen that were mature M2 level, is what they call them, M2 level, ready to successfully be frozen. I pulled out 22 eggs. So it's always a numbers game. 22 eggs got pulled, 17 actually froze, and I haven't unthawed them yet. So I don't know the unthaw rate. But then I froze again at 35. So just 2 years later, and my AMH level dropped a bit. I didn't get as many eggs production, during my cycle. Now, it could have been the way that I was stemmed. It's hard to say. I did go to the same doctor, so I was on a similar protocol. And then I had 13 that were pulled out and 12 successfully froze. So you can see just in that 2-year period of time, I had a number drop. Now, keep in mind, I was on birth control this entire time, so there could have been some effects there as well, where birth control gives you that kind of fake adoption of hormones. So I may not have stemmed as well as if I had gotten off 6 months prior or something like that. But it's still to be noted that it's worth the investment, and you have to think of it like an investment, but it's a numbers game. So I have just under 30 eggs, and that sounds like a lot, but the statistic rate is between 2 and 12% of each egg will turn into a live birth. And as you know, it's a lot of steps to get to a live birth. You first have to freeze the egg successfully, then thaw the egg, then make the embryo, then implant it, and then have a successful implantation, first trimester, second trimester, third trimester, and then hopefully have the baby without any issues. And so that's not just an A to Z situation. It's like a lot of curveballs in between that things could go wrong. So that statistic basically is telling you that basically every dozen eggs maybe equals one live birth. So statistically, my 29 eggs have an 85% chance of turning into a live birth.
All right. Well, I appreciate
you just want to look at it from the numbers standpoint.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really helpful way to think about it and look at it. And there's one thing that I think is important to touch on as well, because so this is something especially that Dr. Marjorie Dixon talked about in our interview. So she's an IVF doctor in Toronto. And so in that interview, she talked about the IVF success rate. So of course, we're kind of going to the IVF part of the conversation, kind of like when the eggs are thawed and making it a baby. But she was challenging the idea that a lot of us have. So in the media, as you know, we see all these images of women having babies into their 40s and early 50s. And because we're not given the backstory, it can leave us with the impression that these women are conceiving naturally. Like it's just a miracle. Like, she's 55 and she's carrying a baby from sex. And so in that interview, Dr. Dixon, she really talked about the impact of the egg, like the age of the woman's actual egg and how that is actually what affects your chances of pregnancy. So it's not even the age of the woman that affects the likelihood of pregnancy, it's the age of the egg. So I'd love for you to talk to us about that in particular, because I think there's at least one person listening who's thinking, well, that sounds nice, but like, couldn't I just get IVF if I needed it when I was in my 40s?
Hey, listen, we all know that random one person's friend of a sister's whose, cousin, aunts, uncles, gave birth at 45 or 50, right? What we don't know is how that actually happened. So egg freezing and egg donation is often not talked about. And so that's part of the taboo I'm trying to help relieve, right? And so, like, for example, when Janet Jackson gave birth at 50, it's not possible that it was her own egg unless she banked eggs in the past and no one knew about it, for example. And so we're seeing a lot of celebrity come out and say, yeah, I'm pregnant, but we don't know the backstory. You're right. We don't know the backstory of how they became pregnant. And a lot of those women are using egg donors. And so you can have many different paths to parenthood. We can actually birth a child well into our 40s, but it doesn't mean that it was our biological egg. So unless you freeze, that's really your best shot at conceiving your own biological child with your DNA. Now, there's lots of ways to become mothers. Like just birthing a child doesn't make you a mother, right? Just like fathering a child with their sperm doesn't make somebody a dad. But it's part of the process of like what we deem as parenthood, right? It's kind of like those descriptives. Well, you pushed a baby outside your vag, so that makes you a mom. But there's lots of different ways we can become a parent. And so I think that if you're open to those ideas and explore them, then it makes the whole process not feel so daunting or overwhelming, and understand that these concepts of like seeing your friend's friend on Facebook or Instagram with all of these amazing baby photos, well, it may not always be what it appears, right? Mm-hmm. So, there's third-party reproduction, there's donor embryos, there's donor eggs, donor sperms. We are pretty well versed with motherhood by choice, like using donor sperm, but it's rarely talked about eggs being used for donor eggs. And many couples have to turn to that. And so I think we shouldn't shame that or make the child feel like their DNA is a secret, right? That's my personal preference, but I understand why some women, maybe want to be a little bit more private about that, because it is kind of hard to wrap your head around the idea or the concept that just because you gave birth to that child doesn't mean that it's biologically yours.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think it comes as a surprise to a lot of women when they find themselves in their early 40s, if conception isn't happening spontaneously, to be told by their fertility specialist that, the chances of a conception with your own eggs past the age of 41, 42, 43 are sometimes less than 1%, like statistically. And so the process that you're describing, the egg freezing process, it allows yourself to be your own egg donor if it's something that you're able to do when you're in your whatever age, like when you're in your 20s or your 30s. But so let's dig into that a little bit more. So tell us, what is the best age? So I'll just give a little background to that question, because I've interviewed a couple of different, a lot of interesting people over the years. And I interviewed Heidi Hayes a couple of years ago, and she is the founder of Donor Egg Bank USA. In that interview, she talked a lot about the process of freezing and why it's important that, as you said, that it's done correctly, because of course if it's not done correctly, the eggs aren't valuable. But she also talked about so their whole thing is having women freeze their eggs in order to be used as donor eggs. So as you talked about, where it's getting more and more common for women to actually, use donor eggs. But it was interesting because she took us through the requirements of a donor. And one of those requirements was that the donor be under 30. So tell us a little bit about when can we do this? Is there a cutoff, or is it good to do whenever? How does that work?
Yes. So when you're being your own egg donor, obviously younger is better. But now when we look at donor eggs, the part of the reason that all those protocols are set in place and they look at these women with such a fine-tooth comb, and weed them out into this very small, minute population is because the couples that are paying for these eggs are spending exuberant amount of money on these eggs. Like some people go in the upwards of $20,000, $30,000 just to buy a slot of eggs. And oftentimes the egg donor, she's getting paid a flat rate, let's maybe say $10,000, and the amount of eggs that she yields are getting broken up into lots, and then many different people can buy them. And so essentially, it kind of think of it like a service, a third-party service that is coming together and pulling all these different pieces together. So they need the best possible eggs possible, because if you're only getting 6 out of that slot, for example, that's not a lot of eggs to work with, and you're paying $20,000 for them. So they've got to be premium eggs, right? So that's why the 20-year-olds are typically the egg donors. Now, when you're donating for yourself or you're egg freezing for yourself, it isn't as potent that you are 20 years old. Now, obviously, you'll get a better yield, or the eggs will be younger and more mature and be able to maybe inseminate better. But you can definitely freeze into your 30s. Just depends on your numbers and your levels, and you can affect your health. So you can take supplements and hormones and these different exercise. Stopping smoking, for example, dramatically helps egg quality. So there's lots of physical things that you can do health-wise to get a good yield. I did 30 days of yoga every single day before my first cycle. I started taking hormones vitamins. I started taking vitamins and supplements that would help my levels. I am not a smoker, so, I didn't have any of those things to worry about, but I did try to go to like a really healthy diet, a clean diet. And all of this prep creates a better cycle. So essentially you just want to make sure that when you commit to egg freezing, that you also commit to all the lifestyle changes to get the best yield. You're spending a lot of money for egg freezing, even if you get discounts. And so you just want the best yield possible. And I also suggest that if you're over 30, that think about multiple cycles, not only just because it's great to have more numbers in the bank of the ice bank, but also too because human error is real, and different embryologists will have a slightly different technique, or maybe that cryo media that's in the lab at that month will be slightly different than the cryo media that is done the month next. Now, a lot of it is standardized and the similar every single, situation, but it just doesn't hurt to have those odds in your favor. And so I just recommend or suggest that, you think about all those other factors.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely a lot to think about. It's interesting in a way. It feels like it's like yet another thing as women that we have to think about. And what's interesting about it is that you may go through the trouble of freezing your eggs just to have them and just to kind of know that they're there just in case things, like if you don't find your pregnancy partner, as you said, but you may wind up not using them. You may wind up just conceiving in your, in your 30s or early 40s naturally and actually not have to use them.
Yeah, so since 2012, when ASRM in the States decided to lift the ban on egg freezing, a lot of new programs have come down the pipeline, and clinics are being more willing to talk about this. Now, I've been talking about egg freezing for over 3 years, since 2015, when I went through my own journey, because no one was really talking about it. And I just wanted to find other women that were exactly like me, that maybe didn't have a partner or, were delaying motherhood on purpose. And so I started talking about these topics. And what I've found over the last 3 or so years is that there's a lot of new programs that are out there these days. For example, Dr. Amy in San Francisco, I was telling you a little bit about her. She started a freeze and share program where, let's say you don't know if you want to freeze your eggs, or you can't afford it, let's just say, but you would be willing to donate maybe half your eggs to someone else, a couple that desperately needs them. And then your cycle would be compensated, but then you would have some in the bank also for later. So that's an option, the freeze and share program. Or, there's other systems where I think are coming to fruition. They may not be completely out yet, but where you can freeze now. And if you get the FDA test for women, you can actually donate your eggs in the future if you don't use them. And there could possibly be some repayment for, the time and collection and storage costs or transportation costs that would be incurred. So it's not that it's an extraordinary amount of money as though you were an egg donor, but there could be some compensation for that. So it's such a new phenomenon in the last 5 or so years that I think more programs like this are going to start to be adopted or come out. I know right now the big thing is these multiple egg freezing cycles, where the clinic kind of has a piece of skin in the game, where they're saying, if you don't collect an X amount of eggs for your age, then we'll comp another cycle to be included. And so you can do that up to 3 times, for example. So there's lots of really unique stuff. Even from the payment perspective, there's even financial fertility-based loans that you can pay over time, kind of like a car payment. And so when you think about the perspective as a whole and you step back and you look at it, it makes egg freezing very attractive and such a great option to do for yourself as women.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to hear all the different options that are popping up. As you were talking, I realized that there are legislative differences. So in the States, you can be paid to donate your eggs, but in Canada, you cannot be paid. So they will compensate you for your travel time or your hotel fees or any expenses that you incur in the process, but you you don't get paid. You don't get any compensation. So, and referring again to the interview with Sarah Cohen, the fertility lawyer, that's actually a problem because if there's no incentive for people to donate, then you just end up with fewer options for couples that really need it. But it's really interesting to think about all the different options, and the freeze and share program sounds really interesting as well, because you're able to help another couple and also cut the cost of freezing. So it's a kind of a win-win type situation there if you're comfortable with that. So you talked to us a little bit about the
you know what?
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was just going to bring up real quick. We are so blessed in the States. And I think sometimes when you live in the United States, you forget that because, like, for example, in Singapore and different countries, maybe even like China, as a single woman, you can't even freeze your eggs. So a lot of medical tourism is coming to the States for women to take advantage of this technology. And so if you are in a geographic area that allows this, feel very blessed about that, because not everyone is given the same rights as fertility rights. And then even like in the UK, you can freeze your eggs no problem in the UK, but they have storage laws that prevent you from being able to keep your eggs frozen after 10 years, which they're trying to change right now. So the laws and the regulations in every country are so vastly different, and understanding those laws and those rights and knowing what your options are definitely helps the situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. And it's interesting to think, especially because, as you mentioned, that this became a thing in 2012 in the States. So being that we're recording this in 2018, it's so new. And that's why this is just starting to be part of the conversation, and why we're just kind of starting to think about how we could fit this into our lives. But on top of that, to consider that in some places women don't have the right to do it, even if the technology is there, is just I don't even know what to say about that. Yeah, because for many women, this would be their, for some women, we don't know what the future holds. So for some women, this would actually be the only chance to have their biological child. To not even have the option to have that is just terrifying to think about it.
I talked to a lot of women in Singapore and in China, and it's so sad because unless they're married or have a partner, a legal partner, they cannot freeze their own eggs, which is heartbreaking.
Yeah, that doesn't even make sense. I was thinking of a question and I think it escaped my brain.
Oh, sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
There's just so much to talk about.
I know. Well, I was going to ask you about the actual procedure. So you touched on it a little bit and talked about the hormones and all of that. So if a woman's actually thinking about it, so someone's in that position now, and this is something that's been on their radar perhaps, so probably not the first time they're hearing about it, but it's actually like maybe they're even tuning into this episode because they wanted to learn more about it for that very reason. What are the first steps that you would take if this is something you actually wanted to consider?
Yeah, that's a great point to bring up. So I taped my last egg freezing journey, and I'm building a documentary right now, which will be out hopefully at the end of the year here in 2018. And I'm calling it This is Egg Freezing because I've gotten asked this question multiple times. And I think the best way to explain it is really just to watch it and see it. Now, I've done hundreds of blogs about the topic and how the procedures have gone from start to finish. I've done podcasts about egg freezing and what's included and how it works. But essentially, just for your listeners to kind of get an overview, you'll want to do your baseline testing. So that would be like getting your regular PAP and your normal yearly exam done. You want to make sure that you're clear of any STDs, because STDs or STIs. So any sexually transmitted diseases can block fallopian tubes, or if you didn't know you had something running through your system, you would want to clear that up before you go through egg freezing. So you want to get all those boxes checked. Then when you see the fertility doctor, they'll run the AMH test, a pelvic ultrasound, and make sure that your cycling is pretty good. Sometimes if you're not on birth control, they'll put you on birth control for a month. That helps get you kind of in a system where they can time your egg freezing with your cycle. And if you are already on birth control, they might ask you to stop. And I actually did a little bit of research unfortunately, after my second egg freezing, that there shows some benefit that if you're off birth control for 6 months prior to egg freezing, that can help generate the hormones that you're taking during the 2 weeks of your cycle. So that can give you a better stimulation. And so when you finally get through all of those components and you have your baseline testing done and your fertility doctor has your baseline for your hormone levels and they've come up with a protocol of what's going to happen during your hormone cycles, they'll issue you all the drugs that you need, which can be overwhelming, by the way, but don't be overwhelmed by that, because I have several blogs on my website, experience.com, for you to read about every drug and what it means and how it works. And so you're given usually a drug at night, which stimulates your ovarian production. And it's usually like a follistim or a gonal-F. And those are hormones that will grow your eggs. So any eggs that you would have in that normal cycle of the month, it'll grow them to large amounts. Once they get, past 10 millimeters, then you need to give yourself an antagonist drug, often like a ganirelix or a citrotide. And that shot is done in the morning to keep your egg in the ovary. So we don't want them to pop out and go down the fallopian tubes and then lose that precious egg. So those 2 weeks, you'll be given a number of different drugs, maybe Menopur is thrown in there as well, which is a great hormone to help with egg production and egg quality. And then during that cycle, you'll come in 3 days after giving yourself hormone treatments. They'll measure your blood again, your AMH levels and different estrogen and progesterone levels. And then they'll also do a pelvic ultrasound to try to count the follicle sizes. And you'll want to grow as many follicles as possible. Now, not every follicle has an egg in it. So don't be misled. Like, for example, if we refer back to my first egg freezing experience, I had 22 follicles, 23 or 24 follicles the entire time I was egg freezing, but only 17 successfully froze. So there wasn't an egg in every follicle. And so just to keep that in mind, that you're completely normal. And some people stem better than others. Some people go through early menopause or hormone loss, where they are not biologically the real age that they are, that maybe their eggs have been older. And so you really don't know how you're going to stem until you actually go through the process. And so you take about that for between 10 days-ish, and then you come in every other day, that second week of treatment, and they're measuring your blood. They just want to make sure you don't hyperstimulate, which is called OHSS. And it's when your follicles grow to the size, they're so large that they might twist or turn, or it could be really painful. So they just want to make sure that your blood levels are all normal and that they're right at that peak, but not pushing you over too much. Otherwise, they might change the doses level that you're taking every day.
Well, and
so the hormones, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to ask. So especially on a podcast like mine, where we spend so much time talking about, natural ways to improve your fertility and the benefits of coming off birth control early to preserve your fertility, I think it comes to mind. I mean, there's different ways to preserve fertility. One of the things that I talk about a lot is that whole concept of preparing ahead of time for pregnancy and all those types of things. But for the listener who's concerned about the thought of putting all these hormones in her body and what the effects could be, you've probably thought about that yourself. There's kind of like this cost benefit analysis type of thing that you do in your head. So tell us just a little bit about that, because I think that, having a short-term exposure to hormones, for this type of peace of mind, reassurance, may be worth it for some women, but for others, it may actually be too much, the stress of the thought of having all the hormones in your body and those types of things.
Yeah, I mean, what I would tell that person is it's a means to an end, right? This is a very small window that you're injecting these hormones into your body. So don't think of fertility drugs as, maybe a negative or like a bad thing that you're doing. Think of it more so as that we're just accelerating the process. We're just basically amplifying what your normal clock, your normal body would normally do in a cycle, and we're taking it times 30. So we're kind of blowing it up into this really massive procedure. And just to finish the meds, it's really only 2 weeks of hormones, between 10 and 14 days. So when you finish the cycling of growing the eggs and making sure they don't go down the fallopian tubes, you then give yourself a trigger shot for 36 hours before your retrieval day. And that is like a last dose of hormones that essentially go into the system and get all the eggs ready to be retrieved. And then they retrieve the eggs and then you're done. I mean, it's a really short procedure. You're out for maybe 15 minutes. And sometimes the recovery can be hit or miss depending on what that trigger dose was. Some trigger doses leave kind of like a hangover effect. And so I had a really easy trigger my first time, but my second time I actually had a delay of like feeling better and feeling like back to myself. But I will tell you that you do get back to your normal self. You are going to be bloated. You are going to kind of feel large and in charge, but everything will shrink back down, right? This is only temporary and it's doing something for your future self.
Well, and one question that I had as you were talking is, how do they retrieve the eggs? How do they get in there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're put under like a light sedation. I think of it kind of like a twilight. It's not you're being put out like as though you're going under surgery, but it is kind of like a surgery. And so what they'll do is they'll use a vaginal probe with a needle on the end of it. And that needle will puncture through the vaginal wall into the ovary and suck out and siphon out all the eggs. And so it's in your anomic fluid, and then they'll sift through that and pull out all the eggs, clean them off, put them in an incubator for about an hour, and then they'll usually let you know the next day like how many successfully froze. So they're put on straws, these tiny little straws, and the egg is the largest cell in the body, but it is so microscopically small that it's thinner than a piece of hair. So, these magic workers, I like to call the embryologists, they're literally like, mini scientists that are doing light year work. The fact that we can even do this technology is amazing. I can't wait to see what's going to come down the pipeline in the next 10 years if this is what we've already come to. But so they'll freeze that and then they'll put it in a cryo nitrogen tank. And that can be frozen indefinitely. There's no time limit per se that anyone knows of, that if you unthawed, an egg from 15 years ago, that it wouldn't work today, 15 years from now or whatever. There's actually even been news and reports about how, well, no, these are embryos. So once again, that goes back to the egg and the sperm already being together, but that there were embryos that were frozen over 20 years ago, and the couple brought that embryo to life and nurtured it through a regular pregnancy and gave birth to a healthy baby. So there are some really great benefits for egg freezing and cryopreservation.
Well, in some ways, it sounds like science fiction, but apparently it's it's real life right now. So, Valerie, I really appreciate you being here today and taking us through your journey with egg freezing and sharing just information so that we can all know a little bit more about it. And so, as we bring our interview to a close, given everything we've spoken about today, what is the one thing, kind of the biggest thing you'd want the listener to take away from our chat?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the biggest thing that you should take away from any discussion about egg freezing is to become your own mini expert and read and learn about egg freezing and what it could benefit you, or what options could essentially help your future. Only you can decide if egg freezing is right for you. And it may not be right for everybody, but it definitely provides a lot of options that we didn't know about. And in fact, after interviewing almost over 100 different women, I've never yet had one woman that told me she wishes she didn't freeze her eggs. So if that's any, encouragement, if you're on the fence and you don't know if you should do it, I just refer back to that, because women are so glad to have the option later down the line, even when it doesn't work. I've also interviewed women where egg freezing didn't work for them, but they're still glad they did it because it made them keenly aware of their own fertility and biological clock, where maybe it could have gone too long and then they weren't able to even do the pregnancy part of their journey. So, because they were proactive with egg freezing, they then became more proactive about other things in their life and choosing to make the right choices each day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so interesting. Whatever connection we have to our fertility really changes things for us. And so thank you so much, Valerie. Where can our listeners go to find more information about you? Tell us again about your awesome podcast for women who want to really do the deep dive into egg freezing.
Yeah, if you want to learn more about egg freezing, I've created a ton of resources for you. The best way to check me out is eggologyclub.com. That's the podcast, Eggology Club. You can find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google. I'm on a number of different platforms. You can also hear it on SoundCloud or different platforms online. And then for more educational resources, blogs and interviews and different resources like books or other websites about egg freezing, you can go to experience.com. So that's EGGSPERIENCE.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, Valerie. It was my pleasure to chat with you about fertility preservation.
Yay. It was exciting.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/225. I hope you enjoyed today's episode with Valerie. It was really just a treat to have her on the show and to talk about fertility preservation. I still think it's pretty fringe. I think that it's something that most of us would never even think about. It's something that also is cost prohibitive for many people because, of course, it's quite expensive to undergo the procedure required to freeze your eggs, and especially at a younger age. But it's very interesting. I think what interests me about fertility preservation is less the actual procedure itself, but more the conversation that comes out of it. I feel like when we talk about something like fertility preservation, all of a sudden it puts the impact of age and fertility, front and center. And although, there's a lot of different aspects about fertility that are starting to be talked about more, really the conversation about the impact of age on fertility, it really needs more attention. One of the things that I've definitely gleaned after interviewing, well over 100 different guests and talking about all these different topics, and also working with women, in my different programs, is that often we think that IVF will save the day. So in the back of our minds, it's kind of like, well, if all else fails, there's always IVF or there's always IUI. I can always do these other procedures and they'll save the day. And what the research shows us is that even with these procedures, as exciting and innovative as they are, their success is highly dependent on your age. So for a woman, that your age is going to be the most significant factor in whether or not any given fertility procedure works. So whether we're talking about IVF or whether we're talking about IUI, and more specifically with regards to IVF, it's the age of the egg itself, not you. So if you're 45 years old and using your own eggs, the research shows that the chance of a pregnancy with your own egg is less than 1%. And I should say the chance of a pregnancy going to full term and you having a delivery. So the chance of a live birth is very, very small. However, if you then take younger eggs, so if you have an egg donor of a woman who's in her early 20s, all of a sudden the chances of that, the chances of the procedure working increase dramatically, because the likelihood of any given procedure, specifically IVF, working is highly, highly correlated with the age of the egg itself. So then it stands to reason that if you were to have the ability to freeze your own eggs at a younger age, it's possible that could increase your chances of conception later on if you had to go the IVF route. So very interesting topic. And I think, like I said, the most interesting thing to me about it is how it highlights the impact of age on fertility, because in this day and age, we see a lot of images in the media of women getting pregnant at these advanced ages. It's very, very common to see, and especially just women, you can't tell how old anybody is anymore. These women will be in their 50s and 60s and they look like they're in their 30s and 40s. And so it really gives us a skewed perspective on our age and how it relates to fertility, and often gives the impression that, we can wait because we have all this amazing technology. But I think what the important thing is to really get educated about these technologies and to really have a much clearer understanding of how age does impact fertility, because there are limits. It's hard. It's a hard reality to face. And so I want to hear from you. I want to hear about your thoughts on fertility preservation. Like I said at the top of the interview, it is definitely controversial. Like, it is something that's very cost prohibitive, it's very expensive, not everybody can afford it. And it's still quite fringe. It's not like a common thing that most women are doing. It would never really cross most women's minds, I'm pretty sure. And so I'm curious to hear what you think about it. So make sure to join us in the Fertility Friday Facebook group. So you'll find us over at fertilityfriday.com/community. And we'll be talking about this episode in there. And so you can kind of throw in your 2 cents. Like, what are your thoughts on it? Do you think it's this amazing scientific innovation that should be available to all women? Do you think that it could be potentially damaging to women to expose themselves to all these hormones and things like that that are required in order to actually go in and harvest the eggs? Neutral, controversial, where do you stand? I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on it. And I just want to thank you for spending some time with me today, for taking the time to tune into the show. I really appreciate you for supporting the show and, of course, sharing the show with your friends. If you know somebody who, you really feel they would benefit from today's episode, please share the episode with them. That's really the best way to get the word out about the podcast and to share this important knowledge with women, just so that we can become more empowered. Knowledge is power, in the sense that, there's a limit to what you can do when you don't even know what your options are. So at least if you get the conversation going and you have a clear sense of your body, your fertility, how it works, and the different options that are available, then all of a sudden you can make a choice coming from a much more empowered place. So with that, I just want to thank you once again. And as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.